So this is our sixth conference that we've done, and it's the third time that we've picked leadership as the theme of the conference. So if you're wondering why, there's a reason also leadership is our middle name, as they say. So, but what we've learned is that more than any one factor, leadership is the most important determinant of someone's career success. If someone's going to have a great career as a CFO, they're going to have to be a good leader. Controllers typically don't get promoted to the position of CFO because of their technical acumen. They get promoted because of their ability to inspire others to become the best versions of themselves. So that's why we pick it as the topic. And some people have thought, leadership is just something you're born with, like, height or blue eyes or male pattern baldness. But it's not. It's something that not only can you work at, but you actually must work at to become an effective leader. And today we have a lineup of some tremendous leaders. I know you're going to enjoy all of the speakers. And in particular, I think today we're going to start off with a bang. I run a CFO conference for my alumni network as well, and it's every year. It's actually here every year in the fall. And so last year, one of the speakers was the CFO of BJ's Wholesale. And he, without being prompted, he spoke reverentially about an executive who's a mentor and a great leader and a genuinely caring person. And she is our first speaker. So that sort of stuck. It's like, okay, let's get Laura to speak at one of our events at some point. And so when Becky and I were discussing potential keynote speakers, we wanted somebody that, a proven ability to lead a company in good times and bad, a true strategic vision, and also someone with unquestioned ethics. So, given what we'd learned about Laura and then looking into her background, she seemed to fit, she does fit all of the boxes. So Laura, she fits all of those. I was going to read a little bit of her bio, but I've only got an hour and it would take too long. The list of accomplishments is really long, and you have the bio in the program, but she's really one of the best CFOs in the area. She's perhaps best known for being CEO and chairman of BJ's Wholesale. Laura will be joined by Ash Noah, who's the VP of CGMA and External Relations. And you had a very successful career as a chief financial officer before that. So he has a lot of insights into the dynamic between a CEO and CFO. So ladies and gentlemen, thanks for indulging me, Ash and Laura.
How long do we have?
Get out, right?
Okay. Great. Oh, you go first. Happiness. Good morning. Well, I am delighted to be here, and I'm really delighted that Jack's invited me back, which is always a good sign after last year. But the conversation today, I wanted to be engaging in terms of you guys engage with us as well as we're talking. So there is if you see the Ask Laura and Ash a question, if you can actually just type in aicpacnf.io, you will find a social Q&A page. And then as you post your questions in, others will see it as well. And you can actually vote the question you like up and things like that. So I'll be picking it up on my iPad and incorporate that into our discussion. So Laura, the role of the CFO, the relationship with the CEO, it has always been a dance, right? A good one. And for many aspiring CFOs, there are things that they need to learn in order to make the transition from being that accountant or being the controller to then becoming a leader and be able to lead the teams. And in my role, I meet a lot of leaders such as yourselves, meet a lot of CFOs, and the question that gets asked often is, hey Ash, you're talking about leadership, you're talking about finance moving, the finance transformation process, moving to the value zone, getting out of assembling information, getting out of analysis, but really going more towards value-adding activity. How do we make that transition? How do I earn a seat at the table? And some of us, we really struggle with our CEO because, we don't have that credibility. And so our chat this morning is going to be around how does a person make that transition? How do we become that leader that has credibility in the business, that from a CEO's perspective, how does the CEO look at that CFO's role, the CFO's office, and how does the CEO's, and so this is really cool because it's a CEO telling us Laura's had at least 2 great CFOs, and I'm really looking forward to this chat. So I'll open up with, yes, the role of the CFO continues to be stretched. It's stretching into operations, we're being stretched strategically because of changing business models, digitization, technology. The CFO is having to deal with all of that. But in order for that CFO to become a credible CFO with the CEO, what are some fundamentals? Where should we start?
Well, first, I want to thank you for having me here and thank Jack for those kind remarks. That was really nice.
Excuse me, Laura, did you turn that off?
No. Did you? No. Sorry.
Oh, you're on?
Okay, sorry, my bad. Thank you for having me here, and thank you, Jack, for that kind introduction. One of the things that I thought about as I looked at the list of attendees here is how diverse the audience is, how many different roles, sizes of companies, industries, so what's sort of common to everyone. And what I thought about is just asking Ash to say, in a few words, what is the baseline role of the CFO? What are our expectations for that leadership position in any organization? So what would you name as the 3 to 5 things that are table stakes for any CFO or finance professional in the room?
I remember my CEO, when I first became the CFO, I went and said, I want to really engage with you. I want to partner with you. I want to be your business partner. I want to be your co-pilot. And he goes, Ash, I want you to first get your numbers right? Go and make sure controls and compliance is impeccable. And the stuff that's coming out of your function is spot on. So get your accuracy, make sure your fundamentals are right. I then want you to start giving me real business insights. I want you to get, so that's number 2. Then he said, I want you to help me with forward-looking information, my forecasts. Try and get those more accurate. And there was CapEx forecasting and there was business as usual forecasting. And our CapEx forecasts were about 40% off. We'd say we'd spent X million, it would be plus minus 30%. And it usually was minus 30% because we never managed to execute how much we thought we would. So CapEx forecasting was a big deal. And then business forecasting, what are we going to do the next quarter? How are we going to make budget, et cetera. So business performance, understanding the business, getting your business, your compliance and your numbers right. And those are table stakes. I mean, you have to get those right.
I think that I would call it quality, whether it's planning, reporting, or forecasting. And the finance realm is critical to the CEO and to the organization. And I think the starting point being that accuracy piece, which, with numbers, there's the number that's right, and then there are a lot of other numbers that aren't right, and there's a lot of judgments that have to be made to come to that number. So what I thought about was, what does the CFO need to have the organization's partnership and cooperation in getting the information and the data that he or she needs to produce that very accurate plan, report, forecast, analysis, and insight into the business. And I think that, I think a CEO needs to recognize that you need resources. Those resources may come in the form of people. They may come in the form of technology. It may come in the form of some outside resource that helps out with the function. But to me, I think that if you're unable to get to that place with the organization and the CEO's support, I think that's the beginning point of being a great CFO, because that's table stakes. Accurate plans, reports, and forecasts.
Right.
Says easy.
So we need to get that absolutely right.
Right.
And then once you've got the baseline, and then you start building towards.
Oh, right, absolutely. And I think that goes hand in hand with getting the data. So do you and does your organization have a great relationship? And I think that word cannot be said enough in this room, a relationship with the different business units. You know, do you support them? Do you understand their business? And I think that's not just from a financial perspective, but from an operational perspective. What are their challenges, and how can you help them as they go about doing what they do to get you to not only to get you the information you need to accurately report out on the business, but also to help them with their challenges from a financial and operational perspective. So I think that as you learn and understand the different business units, internal operations and challenges, you'll be much more effective as you start to craft or try to craft some better advice and strategy for the CEO.
Right. So one is engaging with these different units. One is also engaging with the functional, with the other C-suite, right? So you've got operations, sales, marketing, HR, etc. Right? And so one of the things I always found is in a room of, if you're in a C-suite meeting, there's everybody else against the CFO, right? It's like, I'm the stick in the mud. I am the guy who's the CF no. And really, that getting the credibility to become the CF how is a journey, right? So we started, when we were talking about this whole concept, Laura was saying, hey, table stakes, you need to be able to count your beans, right? And the most derogatory term that these people would use with me is that you're a bean counter, you go count the beans. But it's that transition to become a bean grower, right? I want to be growing the beans, not just counting them, right? I want to be growing them and counting them. And so it's, when you look at the role of the CFO, you've got the governance function, right? And the governance is the accuracy, the compliance, the controls, the governance over the organization, external reporting if you're listed, etc. So that is fundamental to any CFO's role. And then if you progress to being able to engage with the business, then you get into the guidance role, right? And that's where you're a co-pilot to the chief pilot, and you're helping run the business, you're helping them fly the plane. And that's how I look at that transition. You have to, once you get that the governance right, then you can move towards guidance.
Yeah, and I always felt that the finance division and the CFO had a bird's eye view, maybe wrong term, had a view of the soft underbelly of any organization, that whether they were timely, whether they had good accuracy in terms of their own operation, whether they were, I guess, shored up in the way that a finance professional would want them to be. And I think that it is too easy for the CFO and that organization to say, oh, but they always mess this up, and they didn't do that on time, and this was wrong. And I think that it is this role of finance to find these things and correct them, but I think it's more helpful to really help analyze the process. And I would often bring our finance folks in to look at process engineering and say, would you look at how we're doing this in the marketing division and using the different, providers and bringing all the different pieces together, because it was very complex with the membership organization and what we did with marketing, to help them out, because they're marketers, they're creative people, they're thinking about all kinds of ideas. They're not thinking about controls as their first priority. So I think that kind of understanding that as that different parts of the business have different priorities and different ways to think about it other than what a finance professional might think about is enormously helpful. And once you get that trust, which is another big word, trust, it changes everything. So my example that I had told Ash was we had an internal audit function and we were extremely control oriented. In fact, in the back of our name tags for the people in the clubs, they put a penny because that's what we could make on a dollar, right? Like, well, this is a penny business, let's remember this. So we had an internal audit team that was very punishing in the way it worked. And it was a surprise audit. Every club got audited every year for a week. And it was literally, you know, to the detail, and it was culturally very, very negative for the clubs. They lived in fear of the audit. They tried to guess when the audit was going to be. It was just very difficult. And the person who was leading an audit was, the way it ran reflected this person's personality. So when we made a change in management and leadership for that function, this new person who was had a different understanding and actually had come out of the clubs at one point, transformed it to be an education process of what are we going to audit, why are we going to audit it, do you buy into that these are the important things we should audit. And at one point, the audit department said, this is going so well, let's back off of annual audits. And the field said, no, we want these. So it went from this very negative, painful process to a very positive process where the clubs welcomed the audit because they knew it was going to help them improve how they ran their clubs.
It really is about value. You know, if one sees value in that process, they buy into it, and that's what you've just described.
Right.
The new approach was a partnership which was value-based.
Right.
I'm bringing value to you.
Right, it wasn't the gotcha police.
Right. So thank you guys. The questions are coming in, and one of the questions, you know, we started off saying make sure the table stakes are right, and we said you need to build the right, you know, have the right data, have the right team, etc. Right. So the question is, how do you frame up a conversation with the CEO and the board when you need investment in finance? Because finance is always last in line for investment, people investment, etc. So what type of a conversation is framed up to get support for that?
Well, I mean, I think that it's difficult because obviously the CEO variety and is as varied as the people in this room, but I think that the CFO needs to educate the CEO on how in finance and that role should be a partner, a trusted partner, valued partner, an enabler of the business in a good way. And without the right resources and the right investment, that's not possible. You know, I almost ask whether anyone in the room has insights on this, because for me, I'm kind of a lifer, so I always kind of live with the same culture. And for me, the first lesson that my chairman taught me as CEO is, look, this guy is your number one guy. He should be by your side. He should be your most trusted advisor, and always listen to your CFO. So that was my training. So we were not lacking in investment in the finance area because it was such a critical role, and knowing that the controls of the business were so important to us.
Right.
So I mean, I feel like, you know, my husband sits on various boards, and we talked about this a little bit. He comes out of the finance arena, and you know, one of the first things that he did, or the board did, when they had trouble with the financials in this company that he was working with, was add some resources because they just couldn't pull together the results in the right way. But I don't know how you drive that home for your CEO if they're not so inclined.
Well, a good way to start is, do you want your company to be in the front page of the Wall Street Journal, right? Yeah, and for the wrong reasons, right? So the whole thing about having the right governance, having the right structure, is that is no one questions the governance part, and especially when things go wrong, and you know, if you're in a situation where you've gone into trying to fix an issue, right? So you do have support in some areas, but I think we do ourselves a disservice in terms of how we build our business case for our own function. And that, again, is about leadership, looking at your function as a core part of the business. Now, if you know, world-class organizations, cost of finance as a percentage of revenue is now touching 1%, under 1%. I was operating at about 3%, right? So there are varying, depending on the type of industry, and transactional businesses are more expensive, et cetera. But if you look at your cost, and let's say you're 3% of your revenue, and you can take out 20% of the cost, right? In terms of bottom line, you make a business case. Is that more value to the enterprise than driving revenue or driving customer margin? And I'll give you an example. I was in the UK with the CFO of Microsoft. Now, they have used technology to start doing their forecasts. So it's a machine learning platform that is doing their forecasts. They've spent a fair bit of money on developing that over the last 2 years. And their forecasts used to be done by 800 people around the world. And it took them 30 days to get their quarterlies. And they were coming between 3 and 3.5% of the actuals, which is darn good. So machine learning is now doing it in 2 days, and it takes 2 people. And accuracy is close to 1.5% of actuals. So it's doing a better job. It's crunching more data. But and so I said to Paul, what are you doing with those 800 people, right? So the first, you know, you could scale that down to smaller organizations. And he said, we've redeployed them to look at customer contracts, to produce better RFPs for, you know, new customers, to manage contracts and improve profitability, to go in with the right costs. And if I can improve my margin by points, the talent that I have in those 800 people, I don't want to lose that. I can actually deploy that on improving the top line. And suddenly the conversation changes. And I know this is Microsoft, I know they have a lot of money, but I'm just talking about making a business case that really helps you to get investment. We make business cases for the CEO all the time, right?
Right.
Do we invest in this or not invest in this? But when it comes to our own business cases, let's get smart about it.
Right, right. And I mean, I had certainly witnessed in our finance organization, you know, tremendous results from negotiations with credit card companies, really upping the quality and aggressiveness of our non-merchandise purchasing organization, of the club audits and the kinds of things that we could uncover with that, of loss prevention and risk management. So I mean, I saw that routinely, and I think Ash is right. That needs to be demonstrated to the CEO in the ways that finance can add value, not be a cost center.
Right, because we are really thought about as a cost center. And you know, a back office support, an enabler, and that's the shift that we're trying to push, and that's where leadership comes in. A CFO who's a good leader will make a good case, and I mean, and now we're talking about the relationship skills, the ability to influence, the ability to collaborate, the ability to communicate effectively, what, in simple terms, not using jargon, what the business case is, right? There is this thing that went around the internet. The CFO goes to the CEO and he goes, "I want to invest in my people. I need all these new skills. I have to, invest in them so they can become better at business partnering and all of that." And the CEO says, "Well, what if you spend all this money and they leave?" And so the CFO scratched his head and he turns around and said, "Well, boss, what if we don't train them and they all stay?" Right. So again, it's a fundamental shift on how you're thinking about investments, pushing a slightly longer term approach, right? Because when we make our business case, everything is around ROI, right? But there are some investments you have to make where the value is intangible.
Right, and I think that that's the investment piece for the CFO and the finance division is a difficult conversation. I would advocate that you kind of see if there's a way to demonstrate on a small case how a small investment can generate a return. I'm not sure what that looks like in your particular business, but I think that can lead to bigger investments.
Right. So here's an interesting one. How does a CFO deal with a fundamental difference in strategy with the CEO? And I'm assuming this is the business strategy, right?
The business strategy. I think that the CFO, if the CFO has financial information that can be undisputed to show that parts of the strategy or the strategy is the wrong path, that's the best tool. You know, how do you show that with facts? I mean, I'm all about the facts. I think that facts are very important, and of course there are alternative facts. We know that, but you know, you all know that. I think that that's your best case. If you can make the case with the information, with the financial results, with slicing and dicing them in such a way that it shows this path is going to lead us in the wrong direction, that would be your tool, because that's your house, right? That's your shop. I don't know. What do you think?
Good point. No, I agree. That's absolutely spot on. You're absolutely bang on. So while every organization is different, how do we best describe and influence the supporting staff structure? So it's about the CFO and the supporting staff structure, VP finance, controller, directors, managers, and staff to provide the right level of results. So again, this is about being able to have the right level of, underlying infrastructure.
Within the finance.
Within finance. So, VP finance, controller, directors, managers, etc. How do we best describe and influence getting that right structure? It's again,
the structure. One of the conversations that Ash and I had earlier was about automation and technology, and one of the things I would say is, have you really automated anything that's a commodity and that can be automated and use there's amazing technology out there. We know that the barriers to entry to running a business have become so low because everybody on the street can buy some technology and be a retailer or be a marketer or be a restaurant or whatever they are. I would say, have you leveraged the technology in the areas of very routine functions, and have you made sure that you invest in the areas where you need more firepower in terms of analysis, planning, forecasting, and creating business insights so that you've maximized what you can do with what you have? And if you've demonstrated that, I would say if you need more, you've got to lay that out. But if you're still doing too many things manually, how do you get over that hump to really leveraging automation or outsourcing, to the degree that might be a possibility? I don't know.
So always look for more effective solutions.
Yeah, well, certainly efficiency to me is, got to be key to, even in a large board that I'm on, their CFO has an initiative called CFO 2020, and what she's really looking to do is get people out of the day-to-day producing of the numbers and into the analysis of the numbers, and how do you uproot all those weeds, if you will, and get people into a different role. And as you know, when you do that, sometimes those same people who were producing the reports or the numbers are not really suited for another role, perhaps. But I feel like even in an extremely large organization, and I'm on the board, they're still working on this. So it's not just the small startups that struggle with some of these issues.
Right. So there's a question which we can kind of overlay that on the CFO as well. What are some of the core strengths that are needed in order to make that transition from governance to guidance and becoming that real business partner, really moving towards the being growing. What were the qualities and those core capabilities you were looking for?
You're right, and I would go back to something we talked about a little bit earlier. Have you spent, a week in the field, whatever the field looks like for your organization, whether it's out with the sales and marketing people, whether it's out in manufacturing locations, whether it's out in, with my friend over there in the breweries. Have you been out there and really rubbed elbows with these people and spent time? Because, once you've done that, I feel like they'll feel like you're their partner. The other thing, this is a very silly little thing, but somebody told me this very early on in my career, and I thought it was a good suggestion. She said, find out one personal thing about Joe or Jane. Joe loves football. Monday morning you go and talk about the game. Jane has a new grandkid. You go Monday morning, say, how's your grandkid? I mean, that one thing makes you their friend. I mean, you're not really their friend. I mean, you're their colleague and you want to have a relationship with them. I feel like it was just a good suggestion because it takes it from a different level of, you didn't get me this report on time, or, this is a bad number, or whatever, to, we're kind of in this together.
And so if you look at the part of the question is also about type of personalities. Now, do you have an opinion on that? Does it take a type of person? And you talked about your internal audit, who had, the chief had a different approach. Is that to do with the personality?
Well, my boss used to say, the leopard doesn't change his spots, but they can fade. And so, well, we know we are what we are. Everyone in this room is wonderful and great. And we all have some weaknesses. Let's face it, it's true. I think that there are skills that can be built out in people, and most important is if you're self-aware and this is what I'm good at and this is what I'm bad at, get a partner in the business who's good at what you're bad at, because that will round you out. Let's face it, you can improve. And I always advocate for self-awareness and self-improvement and trying to figure out how to get better. But there are just some things that are going to be lacking, and you should find that, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, Bonnie and Clyde, to your partner who's going to be able to balance off where you have some weaknesses. So if you're a CFO who's kind of very rigid and just wants to stick in the numbers and that's what you do, maybe you have a controller who's more social or has higher emotional intelligence or whatever. But I feel like both are possible.
So there are some skills that you can still learn, right? So I don't think a personality should be a limiting factor. So you can learn to be more social, for example.
Well, chances are if you got to CFO, you've got some things going for you. Right. And I think there's no question that there's the ability to change and learn. I just feel like, we have to be self-aware, know how much we can do and how much what we can't do.
Right, so here's a question around if the CEO, so here's an example. Let's say you were making a decision and maybe you were making a wrong decision. How does the CFO best communicate that? In your experience, maybe the CFO has come to you and said, hey, Laura, describe what would you want your CFO to be doing? How should that CFO approach you? And what is the best way of dealing with this situation?
Well, it's interesting. I think the reputation of a strictly finance-driven point of view is that it's a finance-driven point of view and that it may not take into account what's better for the business in the long run. So if the CFO of Amazon were listened to for the first 15 years, they wouldn't be doing what they're doing because they never made any money. And you know what? It was a genius move, right? And as a retailer, I just shrug my shoulders and say, more power to them, they made it happen. So that's an extreme example, but sometimes it's not just about making money and maximizing revenues and profitability. It's about growing the business in a way that will, in the long run, be a winning proposition. And I think that that's where the tension comes. And obviously you all know that, right?
Right. And so just kind of building on that, from your perspective, what is the most important value that the CFO can bring to the table? So I know it's difficult to just name one, but what comes to top of mind?
Well, I go back to quality. I go back to absolutely solid information that really tells us in different dimensions and different perspectives what's going on in the business. And with that, can he or she help us see into the future and say, if this is happening now, this tells us, or this could tell us, these are some watch outs, these are some opportunities, these are some places to go, right? I feel like if the CFO has that strong of an organization that can produce that kind of advisory role for the CEO, it's golden.
Right. So thinking about a CFO, and did you have a chief operating officer as well as a CFO?
No.
Okay, so the question is more around, if you look at is there a significant difference between a COO and a CFO? And does it depend on the size of the business, is the question.
I mean, I would think they're pretty distinct roles.
Right.
And hopefully very complementary,
Right.
where one is really thinking about operations and process and what goes on in the business day to day versus measurement and risk and trends and so on. I mean, I didn't work in an organization that had both, but that would be my expectation.
Right.
Maybe
So they're
probably better to address
complementary.
that. Highly complementary, I
yes,
would expect.
yes.
Almost dovetailed complementary.
Right. And I think that the follow-on question, does it depend on the size of business? I think that's exactly right. Smaller businesses, you find the CFO wearing many hats. And so the CFO becomes more of a generalist across the whole business and almost is a quasi-COO. But I think the person asking this question would also be thinking about that role stretch of the CFO, and is the CFO becoming more and more a COO? And I think there has been a trend of that, where the CFO is also now a COO, or oftentimes they're like co-CEOs. There were some companies that had co-CEOs.
Right.
What do you think of Oracle? You've got Safra Katz, who's actually CEO, but she came from the finance background. So you have CEO and two CEOs. So you've got CEO who's doing the sales, and that's an interesting structure as well. So you've got two co-CEOs.
Yeah, I would think that that's a little difficult
Right.
at times, but I mean, there are. I'm cautious to accept any exception, anything that's extremely out of the ordinary, as an example of what might or might not work. Because certain personalities, it could be perfect, but
Right.
I don't think that that's necessarily the norm or what we'd expect.
Right. So, what are your thoughts of the CFO leading the business game, the game of business, to help the path towards being growing? So,
Being growing.
do you see the CFO as, leading that game of business?
Well, certainly as it comes to any kind of financial engineering, for lack of a better term, where the CFO will have thoughts and ideas about use of capital, how to manage expenses, how to improve process, how to avoid risk, how to invest, that may not be in the purview of the CEO. And I think that all of those, it's a different mindset, right? As finance professionals, they just see the world differently. And I was fortunate to work as a CEO of BJ's as a public company and as a private company,
Right.
so I saw some different things.
Yes.
And I mean, to me, the whole world of financial engineering was like, wow. I mean, I'm a merchant. I buy and sell stuff. That was kind of my stock and trade. So yeah, I think that there's enormous value that can come from the financial side. And again, it goes back to what you started with, was how do you add value? What does that look like? And how can you be creative? And I think that that's important, because I think sometimes people don't feel like the finance part of the business is creative. And I think that there's a tremendous amount of creativity that can be exercised through that lens. Right.
And so if there is a CFO who's trying to make that transition from bean counting to bean growing, what are some of the key things that he or she needs to be thinking about, focusing on, in order to make the transition? I think one of the things you said before was going out to the business, understanding the
Yeah, you got to
business.
put on your overalls and get dirty if you're going to grow
Right.
some beans.
Right.
Get your
Right.
tractor.
Right. Get your hands dirty.
Well, yeah, that's
Right.
what I think. That's a good
That's-
analogy, right?
You think that's where it should start, and it's a good starting
Well,
point.
I mean, I think that it's two-sided. You have that knowledge, which I tremendously respect, as you hopefully can tell,
Right.
that comes with the sort of education and experience that happens in the finance arena. When you really think about, what are the jobs of the other people in the company, whether it's HR, marketing, IT, manufacturing, or stores, or whatever your core business is, really understand what their challenges are, and really think about how can the finance capability help them out. Can you help them invest in some technology that will improve their business? Can you help them with process? Can you help them really figure out how to be more efficient? I mean, I saw our finance division come up with some great ideas for the clubs. How to have less cash in the cash register. Like, that seems kind of basic, but we just had what we had, and it's like, well, with less use of cash, that's good not to have more cash out there. So, that's a very simple example, but I think there's a tremendous amount that finance can bring to the table when it really has that ability to dig into the different parts of the business in the right way.
Right, without being the police.
Oh, no.
And this is being
Right,
really,
this is being the police.
Right.
Being the social worker.
Right, exactly. So in terms of, a company where, as a CEO, what would you think of a CFO who goes directly to a board member with questions?
CFO?
The CFO going directly to a board member.
Depends on the question.
I'm sorry. Let me rephrase that. I just read that wrong.
Okay.
Are you comfortable with a board member going directly to the CFO? Sorry, not the CFO going to the board member.
I mean, I actually talked to the CFO of the company I was thinking about getting together with her just to get more education for myself. I wasn't really looking to question or go behind the CEO's back. So I would say that, I would imagine, unless the board member was trying to dig around in an inappropriate way, which I've seen,
Right.
it would be fine. But it's kind of one of those situations where if it's innocuous like mine, I just really would like some more training and education because it's technical and it's not my field, versus, what's going on behind the scenes type of thing. That's bad business.
Right. So long as it's done with the right intent.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And transparency. I'd tell the
transparency,
CEO,
yeah.
look, I want to get together with your CFO for this reason, and I find that perfectly fine.
Right. So here's a question. Understanding and adding value to operating areas is key to a successful partnership between accounting and finance and operations and the business teams. But it's often difficult to get support in the accounting finance area since it helps operations. So I guess what we're saying here is, yes, the partnership is important, and yes, accounting and finance should make the move and go out, but should accounting and finance be in operations? Is it a no-go zone? How do you get support in actually getting involved in operations?
You know, it's
I
funny,
guess,
in our example, we actually had a mini finance operation in every division, so that the sales operations, so that's the clubs, the stores, had its own finance function, and marketing had its own finance function, and IT had its own finance function. And these were either run by finance people. In the case of IT, it was so complicated, it had to be finance people right in there, or in partnership with the finance people. Merchandising had the same thing for merchandise planning. So that because there's so much finance in each one of the operating divisions, there was a mini finance area that would sort of ensure the right quality and then the right feeds to the bigger financial picture. I think it has to be in a large organization, whether it's owned by finance or owned by the division. There has to be that partnership.
Yeah, operations has, in my history, always desired more help.
Of course.
So, you know, there is a recognition, we do need help. And when you do position yourself as support, they do welcome you in. So it's how you position yourself. If you're going in to, you know, poke holes and find fault, then it's a harder game.
Right. So did you have a finance area in there, or it's just supporting there?
Right. So we eventually ended up having embedded finance within each of the functions.
Right.
And
Right.
The trick was to get them to report within the organization. Earlier, they used to continue to report back to finance, and they were like the spies.
Right.
So you don't want that.
There's no spies.
So once you change the reporting line and you say, okay, you report to that unit's head, whether it's, you know, and then there is.
Right, and we used to use this phrase, which, it's kind of silly, but, one version of the truth. That's what we want.
Right.
We just want one version of the truth, which is very difficult. When we had very old legacy systems, so getting there was a drag. Right.
Yeah, I remember every time I'd stand up and put information about this is the amount of new business.
Oh.
The minute you go beyond that, beyond your reported numbers, it starts to become a challenge. The marketing guy would have another number. Field operations.
We've seen this movie, right?
Right.
It's not a happy ending. You really need to get to that, right? Right.
Absolutely. So there's a question here which is kind of like about the change in you being a public company and then going private. What did you find were the biggest differences, and what challenges did you face, you and your CFO, of that change, being a public company and then going private?
Well, obviously it's an enormous change. So the good news is that all of your time that is spent, I guess, facing Wall Street for the reasons of being a public company and all that entails goes away. Yep. And the private ownership calls for a different way to think about the business. In some ways, I guess one of the things I'd like to just leave the group with is that I learned that you need to think about all of your stakeholders in balance. So if you're only thinking about your private owners or your, stockholders, that's just not enough.
Right.
You need to think about your employees, your team members.
Yeah.
You need to think about your customers, and in that probably in almost equal focus. I mean, I kind of learned that if you thought more about your team members, you would then in turn be taking care of your customers, because they would feel that continuity of care, if you will, and your investors, the communities that you serve, and then of course your owners. I mean, to me, focusing on one dimension which is either your shareholders or your private owners, is fine. But that's not it. I think you should really focus on your key constituents in balance and understand that every decision has to keep them all in balance.
That's a really, really good point, Laura. There was a recent survey done by KPMG. 97% of the CEOs said the CFO needs to focus on their people, talent, develop competencies. And I just want to close with that in terms of, if you are looking for solutions for developing competencies, and especially in this age where you need competencies around business relationships, collaboration, being able to communicate effectively, etc. CGMA is exactly that. So I do want to plug in
this is the ad?
that at the end. Exactly.
Okay.
But CEOs are seeing that the CFOs are not focusing on people, on their teams. And it is important that you think about your teams, you think about developing them. You cannot do it on your own. You need every one of them. The CFO is not a one-man band and one-woman band. It's your team. So thank you for giving me the segue there to close this. So just final thoughts on, two key things the audience should be thinking about as they leave.
Yeah, I say relationships. That's it. I mean, certainly building a great team, having great quality, and developing those relationships throughout the organization, that's what will put you at the seat of the table and be the kind of trusted CFO that I had and relied on every day.
Fabulous. Thanks very much. Thanks for having us. Appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. That was awesome. Up to you.